Hello there, friends. Andrea with the Bangs here, and on today's episode of She Wonders Why, I was able to have the pleasure of interviewing theoretical physicist Sean Carroll. He was kind enough to give me a little quick intro to his specialty, which is quantum mechanics. You can imagine it's a pretty heavy topic, so they say people know their stuff the best if they can explain it in the simplest of terms. And he was, like I said, kind enough to take me through. Then we move on to discuss subjective versus objective. I wanted to talk to him about meaning, and the conversation goes into the direction of how it is that we sort out things that are true for you or true for me, opinion sort of perspectives, and how that's okay to talk in those terms, and what exactly it means to pursue objective truth, even though I find it hard to comprehend the concept of the objective, since we all have our subjective lenses, our own ways of viewing the world. Sean was kind enough to let me pick his brain about such things and his perspective. I found him to be so open-minded, and I really, really enjoyed discussing these things with him. So thanks so much, Sean, for coming on the show. And I hope you all enjoy this episode. Please do not forget to leave me a comment. And if you haven't yet, please remember to subscribe. Hello, Sean Carroll. First of all, do you go by Sean or do you go by Dr. Carroll?
Sean is fine.
Okay. I just, just get the niceties out. I don't want you to be wondering why didn't she double check? Do people double check?
Sometimes, but look, I've been on the internet long enough. Everyone knows me as Sean. So
okay. It gives a little bit of a, we're just here to chat. Nothing official. So I've been doing a bit of a series on meaning, and I like getting different perspectives of meaning from different genres, I guess. And so you are the science genre, specifically the physics genre. But I do want to go into a bit of background as to what you do and why you're the science man.
Good.
So what is your specialty?
So my day job is I'm a theoretical physicist at Caltech, which means that I'm what we call a pencil and paper theorist, or pen and paper. So I don't use computers in any big way. I don't go to telescopes. I don't have a lab or anything like that. I basically sit at my desk with a pencil and paper, or with an iPad and Apple Pencil, and scribble down diagrams and equations and try to come up with new ideas to explain the universe. So the kinds of ideas that I care about are gravitation, quantum mechanics, cosmology, the Big Bang, dark matter, dark energy, statistical mechanics, things like that. Okay.
So just run of the mill, really light.
What you do, for your spare time, sure.
Yes. Okay. So, you said that so succinctly. I was giving a little bit more time for that, but
I could go on. Don't worry.
No, you know how to. You said you've been on the internet. You know how to break it, put it into sound bites. But
right.
You actually came to mind as to I think I'd want to talk to Sean Carroll about this. I saw Russell Brand interview Ricky Gervais, and Russell was asking about, I think, just mystery. Where do you see where is mystery in the world for you? And because Russell was kind of giving a more sort of spiritual answer, and then Ricky was giving he definitely had an answer. I was kind of what are you gonna say? But he brought up your field. He brought up the quantum mechanics and what's being done in that space. And I don't know much about that. And so I mean he went on about it, but I kind of, that's why you came into mind. I was why is that so mysterious to people?
Well, I think that there's two sides of that. One is there's a famous fact, Richard Feynman talked about it, many other people talked about it, which is that physics is hard because physics is easy, by which we mean Physics is the simplest subject matter we have. It is a field of science in which you can ignore all sorts of complications. And this goes back to Galileo dropping balls off the Leaning Tower of Pisa, right? Whether he ever did that or not is unclear. But the point is, he was demonstrating the fact that, sure, if I drop a ball and a feather off of a tower, they will fall at different rates. But he says, what if I ignore air resistance? What if I have two balls made of things that are the same size, but the same shape, but different weights because they're different densities, okay? Then I can just ignore the fact of air resistance. They're more or less the same. And despite the fact that they're different masses, they will fall at the same rate. So this tiny little move is absolutely genius and sets the stage for all of modern physics, because that's what all of physics is. It's saying, let's simplify to the point of absurdity. Let's look at the very basic rules in their own rights, and then we can build complicated things on top of that. And then you can always add in air resistance later, right? And that strategy has been so enormously successful that we have pushed the frontiers of our knowledge way past what we experience in our everyday lives, right? The realm of atoms and particles and quantum mechanics, also the realms of cosmology and astrophysics and galaxies and black holes and stuff like that. So what happens is, because we're so good at doing physics, because it's so easy, we can do physics in a really impressive way. Whereas, in biology, if you say, okay, let's talk about how the lungs work, but we'll ignore the heart and the blood. You're like, no, you can't actually do that, right? You can't separate those things out very easily.
Okay.
In economics, if you said, let's study trade while ignoring fiscal policy, well, that wouldn't work either. Everything is connected to everything else. In physics, you're allowed to simplify things and look at them one by one. So what's happened is we've been led to understand things, on the one hand, mathematically within the professional regime of physics, but they seem really weird to the people on the street who are not professional physicists, because of course they are, because they're very far removed from our everyday experience. They're very far removed from anything we're trained to understand. So there's one aspect of the mystery of physics, which is just, it's very far, the frontiers of physics are very far away from what we are used to dealing with in our everyday lives, whether it's black holes or electrons. You don't bump into a black hole or an individual electron in your everyday life. Right. So nothing in your experience, nothing in biology, nothing in our intuitive picture of the world prepares you to deal with this and understand it. So when you do see what physicists say about it, it will seem weird to us, seem mysterious. But that's a fake kind of mystery, because we really do understand it. It's just hard. You just need to do the work. You just need to understand the math and whatever. There's another kind of mystery, which is, of course, that physics is nowhere near done yet. There are questions we don't know the answer to. What happened at the Big Bang? What's going on inside black holes? What is the dark matter? How does quantum mechanics really work? These are all really hard questions, but these are the kinds of questions that every science has, right? Every science knows some things, doesn't know other things. Physics is no different than that. So physics is full of mystery. Physics is full of things we don't yet know the answer to.
Okay. I'm trying to remember your interview where you did talk about your book with Joe Rogan, where you actually go into the quantum realm. So, and do we not really understand it? Quantum gravity, we don't know that yet, right?
Quantum mechanics, which sort of came into its current form in the 1920s or thereabouts, is not by itself a theory of physics. It's a framework in which you do physics. Okay. It replaced the earlier framework, which was classical Newtonian physics.
Right. Okay? Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah.
So F equals ma, balls rolling down inclined planes and pendulums and stuff like that. All of that is classical Newtonian physics. And the paradigm there is, you tell me where something is, you tell me how fast it's moving, and you tell me what forces are acting on it. And that's all you need. Once you tell me that for everything in the universe, I can tell you what's going to happen next, okay? And I can tell it to you in principle to 100% accuracy, and that's all there is. There's literally nothing else to say other than that. What is happening in the universe at different moments of time?
Okay.
So quantum mechanics comes along, and there's a lot that is different. So classical mechanics by itself, there's a lot of different theories that you could fit within it, because what is the stuff you're talking about? Is it a particle? Is it a planet? Is it a field like the electromagnetic field? Whatever. Quantum mechanics comes along and the same thing. It's a framework in which to do physical theories, but it's not tell me where something is and tell me how fast it's moving. Rather, you have this thing called the wave function, which basically we're still, and this is where it answers your question, we still don't agree on what the wave function is, okay? We can define it mathematically, but if you want to say philosophically, like, what does it correspond to? Is it a map of reality? Or is it just a way of characterizing our ignorance? Or is it part of reality, but not all of it? Like, we don't have any agreement on that, okay? But how we use it, we know very, very well. And how we use it is the wave function tells you the probability of getting an observational result when you look at the system.
Okay.
So if you think like the electron is spread out, its wave function looks like this.
Yes.
That means you will probably see it where the wave function is big, and you will probably not see it where the wave function is small. That's all it means.
Right. Okay. So you know, like the probable part, but you don't know why.
Well, you don't know why, and worse than that, if you look at the textbook, if you read a quantum mechanics textbook, it has two sets of rules for a quantum mechanical system. I'm plugging in my computer. Sorry, I might run out of power, which would be bad.
Okay.
Okay, now we're plugged in. There's a set of rules in quantum mechanics that looks exactly parallel to the rules of classical mechanics. You tell me the state of the system, and I will tell you how it will evolve. There you go. That's very easy. But then there's this whole new set of rules which have to do with the outcomes of observations or measurements, okay? And that's where the probability comes in, but also the state of the system, the wave function of the system changes dramatically when you observe it. And the bad part is nobody tells you what they mean when you say you observe it. What counts as an observation?
Oh, right, because you
or a
can't,
measurement?
like, you can't see it with even, or can you with like
Well,
microscopes?
you can see that this is the mystery. You can see an electron. We can take pictures of them. We can take little measurements of tracks as they move through a bubble chamber, for example. But when we're not looking at them, they're not tracks. They're spread out. You never see that spread out wave function. When you look at it, it appears to be something very different than when you're not looking at it. And that's bizarre, and we don't claim to understand it.
Okay, and so this is where the mystery part of it is. This is where it's sort of like we don't get it, but we hope to get it.
Well, we certainly do hope to get it. I mean, so there's two more little footnotes here that are worth mentioning. One is you mentioned quantum gravity, that's a specific kind of quantum mechanical theory we would like to someday have, okay? So the other theory, the other forces of nature and particles of matter that we know about, the electrons, the photons, the gluons, these all fit perfectly comfortably into the framework of quantum mechanics. We have no trouble. They're fundamentally quantum mechanical in nature.
Okay.
We think that gravity should be also, but we haven't yet succeeded in doing it.
Right.
And everyone knows we haven't yet succeeded, and everyone cares a lot about that, and enormous number of IQ points are devoted to the program of trying to understand how to reconcile quantum mechanics with gravity. Okay.
Right.
So that's a very respectable thing.
Okay.
But the other thing, meanwhile, is, well, what about this fundamental quantum mechanical mystery of the measurements of what the wave function really is?
Yeah.
You would think that would be an even bigger problem. Like that would be the primary problem that everyone was devoted to trying to understand.
Is it
and as
not?
I say in my book, I wrote a book called Something Deeply Hidden. I say, like, this is the thing that you would think, Harvard and Princeton are spending huge amounts of money throwing salary at academic superstars who are the best in the world at understanding this. So it's the opposite of that. In the real world, if you're a physics student and you say, what I care about is understanding the measurement problem of quantum mechanics, you get kicked out. You're not a real physicist. You're a philosopher. You don't care about the real problems. Go find a job somewhere else.
Philosopher? What?
Yeah.
But okay, can you explain to me? Well, I mean, I love learning from you about this, but I'm gonna go in the space of the meaning space pretty soon here, where we can converse as opposed to me just like doing my best to understand. But why? So why philosophy?
Well, so it's a legacy. It's a relic of the early days of quantum mechanics. So back in the 1920s, there was a debate. In fact, it's a very famous debate, not a single event, but an ongoing discussion between Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr.
Okay.
Okay, at the birth of quantum mechanics. And Bohr kept saying, okay, here are the rules of quantum mechanics. You have a wave function, you measure it, you get a probability, blah, 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 blah. Einstein was like, give me a break. Surely you don't think that we're finished, right? Like, this is fine as a step along the way to the real truth. But you can't possibly believe that all this mess about observation and collapse is fundamental and real. And Bohr said, yes, it is. And in the public relations sphere, Niels Bohr won that debate absolutely decisively.
What?
Okay. Yeah, Einstein, who you would think would have some credibility here, was just dismissed. He's too old, he's lost his way, the poor guy doesn't keep up anymore, which is all complete nonsense. But one of the reasons why that was a possible thing that could happen is that even though we had these questions about what happens when a quantum mechanical wave function collapses, what happens when you make a measurement, we didn't have any way to do experiments that would tell us anything about what the answers would be. And that's partly why it became a matter of philosophy. People talked about interpretations of quantum mechanics. Like, they didn't talk about real separate physical theories. They talked about it as if it were literary criticism, right? As if you were arguing over a movie or a painting or something. You're talking about how best to think about quantum mechanics. And that became the conventional wisdom, that we understand the science of quantum mechanics, but we don't understand how to interpret it. And I think that was just wrong. I think that was just a mistake from the start. What we didn't understand was the science. And so nowadays, those of us who care about this talk not about interpretations of quantum mechanics, but about foundations of quantum mechanics, what the theory is actually saying.
Okay. So you are trying to follow along the Einstein sort of legacy.
I'm on Einstein's side. I'm very happy to say that.
Okay. I mean, who doesn't want to be on Einstein's
Well, look,
side?
Niels Bohr was an absolutely brilliant guy, Nobel Prize winner, the grandfather of quantum mechanics, made numerous incredibly important contributions. But he's also a very funny guy. Like, his writing is notoriously hard to read. He's not clear when he writes things. But people kept testifying that when they talked to him, he was incredibly persuasive. And I did a podcast.
I actually remember. I'm like, I remember this because I remember thinking that was really.
I did a podcast with David Albert where he says, like, if I had the opportunity to have dinner with anyone from the history of quantum mechanics, it would definitely be Niels Bohr, because somehow there's this long line of people, very, very smart people, who went and talked to Niels Bohr and came away spouting nonsense about the foundations of quantum mechanics and saying that Niels Bohr was the most brilliant guy ever on the earth. Yeah. So I don't know how he did it, but a lot of what he says to me doesn't make sense. So I don't want to denigrate Niels Bohr as a scientist or a thinker, but in this particular debate, I'm on Einstein's side.
Okay. Well, I think that sounds. Well, I mean, I kind of am biased. I had heard of Einstein before, other than your one podcast. So I actually I listened to the opening to your I think it's your latest book, the one where you want to talk about something
deeply hidden.
That's it. Yes. Okay. So I actually only wanted to listen to the beginning because I wanted to not know what you would say.
All right.
So I really like that you're open to talking about meaning from this scientific perspective, because it makes sense that we need to know where we are in the world in order to understand what our meaning is, and where better than to start with the fundamentals of science, right? And sorry, yeah.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, when you say meaning, maybe let me ask a question, so we're on the same wavelength here. The word meaning has more than one meaning. So I want to sort of know what you have in mind. I mean, one kind of meaning is just the one I just used, like the dictionary definition of something. This word means this,
Right.
or this piece of information means something. It represents something else about the world,
Okay.
right? There's a sort of correspondence between the terminology and reality. But the other sense of the word meaning is the meaning that I bring to my life, right? The meaning of life kind of stuff,
Right.
you know, the purpose or the driving impulse or what matters to me in existence as a
Right.
human being. So when you're saying meaning, which one of those are you mostly thinking about?
I'm mostly thinking of the second definition you gave.
Okay,
Okay.
good.
Let's hope we can
That's
go
fine. I
with
just want to know
this.
which one. I wasn't going to judge you on which one. They're both interesting.
Yes. Okay. So you talk about the old way of looking at, I just wrote it down. The old way of looking at meaning, the second definition that you gave, from a scientific perspective. I was wondering if you could go over what that old way is and why. Why was the more nihilistic sort of end result of. Do you recall what I'm talking about?
I do not.
Okay.
You know, but let me just mention, you know, my previous book, which was called The Big Picture,
Okay.
on the origin of life, meaning, and the universe itself.
Okay. Oh shoot, I went
So
with the latest one. Maybe
in that book, I actually talk about meaning.
maybe it
quite
was
a bit.
that one. Maybe. Oh,
It might have been that one.
Okay. So in the book in which you speak about meaning,
Right. Okay. Good.
that
Good.
book.
Yes. Now I get it. Now I know exactly what you're referring to. Okay.
I'm so sorry.
So no. I mean, you know, there's a lot of books. I'm glad that you've read more than just the recent one.
Okay.
So yeah. So what I do, and obviously, The Big Picture was a big book,
Mhm.
and even though it was a big book, it covered an even bigger terrain. So I skipped over a lot of very, very heavy things very quickly.
Okay.
And I will always beg indulgence by the people who are experts, who, like, every single paragraph of the book, you know, someone's career was made about, you know, discussing that.
Yes.
And they're like, how can you reduce it to a paragraph?
Yeah,
Okay, so let me do that right now.
Okay.
And distinguish between sort of two fundamental notions of what the world is and how it works. One is this, what you call the old-fashioned way, what you might call an Aristotelian way of looking at the world,
Okay.
which is that the world is characterized by natures and purposes, teleology, goals, right? There are reasons why things exist. There are reasons why things happen. You can talk about and understand the motion of a rock rolling down a hill, because you can say, well, it is the nature of the rock, which is made of earth, to be low on the ground. And so it moves toward a lower point that's sort of fulfilling its nature.
Okay.
It's also, you know, fits in pretty well with Plato's idea. Plato was Aristotle's teacher, and Plato had this idea of the Platonic essences of things, okay, that told you the fundamental stuff that from which our observed world were just pale reflections, okay?
Right.
And, you know, this makes perfect sense if you lived 2,500 years ago and you were doing your best to understand the world. Fire tends to go up, earth tends to go down. This is a sensible thing to think. And it really was Isaac Newton who basically replaced this way of looking at things, although I would say he himself wouldn't have said that. It was sort of a spin-off of what he did. Again, Galileo, more than anyone else, gets credit for the way of thinking. And another physicist, Pierre-Simon Laplace, circa the year 1800, really gets credit for appreciating the implications of what Newton did. And the implications are the following, that if you give me, you know, we talked about the state of a system, right? The position and the velocity. So he says, Laplace says, if you give me the position and velocity of everything in the universe at one moment in time, then I can use Isaac Newton's equations and I can predict both what will happen in the future with perfect accuracy and what did happen in the past with perfect accuracy. So in other words, at every moment in time, there's a certain amount of information that tells you exactly what the universe is doing, and that information is conserved over time. And the point is that in this picture, the universe isn't aiming toward a goal. It's not trying to fulfill its nature. It's not trying to, you know, partake of its essence. It simply is, and it's obeying a pattern.
Okay.
So the way of thinking about the motion of things is not motion toward a goal, but fitting into a pattern, which is very different. You know, I talk in the book about think about the integers, the numbers, okay? 0, 1, 2, 3, but also -1, -2, -3. So if you pick out the number 7, it's certainly true that the number 1 less than 7 is 6, and the number 1 more than 7 is 8, okay? But you don't say that 8 is because of 7, or you don't say that 7
Okay.
is trying to become 8 or anything like that. There's just a pattern. There's a series of numbers different by 1 from their neighbors, okay? Plus or minus 1. And so that's the Laplacian or Newtonian or physical or mechanistic way of thinking about the universe. The things like purposes and meanings are not part of the fundamental architecture of reality. I would argue this later in the book, if you had kept reading, they're still there in the universe, but they're higher level, emergent, constructed things. They're not
Okay.
built into reality itself.
Okay. Now, what about the idea? Because you do say how you. I don't remember how long ago, but there was a space where it was pretty nihilistic in there's no purpose, and so therefore, like building off of what you just said, like so therefore, there's only these patterns, and there's only these like our current way of looking at the world ends up in a sort of nihilistic void. I don't know. That's what I was getting from that. And
Yeah, I think the way that I would put it is we haven't come to terms, even now, with the implications of this scientist way of understanding the world in terms of patterns rather than purposes. There are people who've certainly pointed it out, right? The existentialists and their precursors, Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Sartre and Camus and Dostoevsky and others point out the fact that once you take away, not just God is one example, but even in a much broader picture, once you take away the idea that there is a purpose given to us, okay, then it's scary. And, maybe we are adrift. Maybe it is just nihilistic. There was a place where the purposes came from before physics came along, and that place has been squelched. That's gotten rid of, right? So either you can say, all right, there are no purposes, there's no meaning to life, it's all just noise
yes.
and equations, and I'm very depressed right now. Or you could ask, is it possible that we still have purposes and meanings, that we still have morality and ethics and things like that, but they're actually being derived from somewhere else? It's kind of like it's a little reflection of the, I'm not going to pronounce it correctly, the Euthyphro dilemma.
Yes, yeah.
Plato.
Oh,
Right?
Philosophy 101. I remember
Yeah,
it.
exactly. Everyone knows about it. He says, look, you're telling me that what is good and what is bad comes from God. He was not a monotheist, but that was basically the scheme. And he said, well, but was it good if God didn't say that? If God said that something bad was good, would it be good? Is it good because God says it's good, or does God say it's good because it's good? Right? And in my mind, even if you were a theist, that's a challenge. People claim to have overcome it in 12 different ways, but I think it's still there. I don't think it's completely overcome. I think that there is a little bit of a chicken and egg problem there. So I think that even though you remove many of the pre-existing justifications for purpose and meaning, they weren't very good justifications in the first place, and you should have been thinking deeper all along.
Well, I mean, I guess if people have been thinking about the Euthyphro problem for coming up on this many, I mean, I guess it's from there on that we've been going over this. Plato just articulated it really well. But could you go into that a little bit more?
Sure. So in both, let me parenthetically say something else. The existentialists would have said, yeah, there is no fundamental purpose and meaning, but you can still try to live an authentic life in some way. They sort of babbled about that. There is another strain of thought in popular culture, which is the other extreme, which says there's no gods, there's no purposes, there's no, sorry, I shouldn't say there's no purposes. There's no gods, there's no spirits, there's no intelligent designer for the universe. But I can use science and logic and reason to figure out what the objective truth of purpose and meaning, of right and wrong are.
That's what I was gonna
Right.
ask
So
what
there
you
are
think
people who
about.
think that even though God has been removed from the picture in this way of thinking, morality is just as objective as it ever was. Purpose and meaning are just as objective, just as scientific, just as logical as they ever were. Okay. So that's not what I think. I think
Okay.
that that's still fooling yourself. I think that that's almost sort of not completely escaping the tradition of the religious upbringing that gave us an objective source of meaning and purpose and morality.
I totally
It's just trying to
agree. Yeah.
just trying to replace God with science, okay? But
Yes. Yeah.
the much more difficult thing, and that doesn't mean it's right, but I think it is the much more difficult project, is to say morality and meaning, purpose, ethics are just not objective. That doesn't mean
Okay.
they don't exist. Like what is the best fruit? That's not objective. Different people are going to have different opinions about it, but
Yes.
their
Yeah.
opinions are perfectly good. Their opinions aren't mistakes. You're not making a mistake when you say bananas are my favorite fruit. You're just expressing a subjective opinion.
Okay.
So I think that morality and meaning are something like that. Not exactly like fruit, but they are
Not quite like fruit. I'm gonna
not
call
exactly
it
like
that
fruit.
this episode by that name. Not
Not
quite
exactly
like
like
fruit,
fruit.
folks.
Yes. I think that they're fundamentally constructed by human beings. They're
Okay.
not out there in the world. And
Okay.
once you say that, then obviously there's a huge problem, a huge program in front of you. All right, so what is the morality and meaning that we should construct?
Because
I
we
think that's a
went through
very,
what it
very good
isn't.
question.
You went through both sides of like this is too far and now the other was too far. So we're looking for what the middle is. And you just said
Well,
it's
it's
subjective.
almost more like a triangle, because I'm not in the middle of. I mean, there's one side. So let me say it this way:
Okay, okay.
there are two questions. Okay, one question is. Do God and spirits and so forth, Platonic essences, do they exist separately from our physical reality, or do they not? And in that case, I'm clearly on the they do not side of things.
Okay.
The other question is, can morality and meaning and so forth be objective? And there you can side with the God people and say, I don't believe in God, but I still believe in objective morality and so forth. I'm still on the other side there. I'm saying, no, there's not even any objective morality. And there's a third position, a fourth, I don't know how many we're on now, but there is that existentialist position or even a nihilist position that would just say, you can't even construct it. You're just fooling yourself. You're just not facing up to the reality. There's just no reasons, no purposes in your life. That's where I take the middle ground, in between people who say I have an objective purpose, an objective meaning, and people who say there's no such thing as meaning or purpose at all.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I have written down here poetic naturalism.
Yes.
And I would like you to talk about, is that sort of that
That's the big picture. That's what the big picture is all about.
So
yes,
that's
exactly right.
Okay, so could you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so naturalism is the idea that there are no gods and spirits. It's the idea that all that exists is the natural world, the world that we measure and observe using science, and a world that empirically, by doing that science, we discover it obeys patterns. It does not try to follow purposes or anything like that. It just does its thing. It's really just a little black box you put in one state of the universe, the next moment pops out, okay? That's what the laws of physics do. That's naturalism in my way of looking at it. Poetic says, but there is more than one way of talking about the universe. There's more than one language we can use to describe it, and those different languages can all have claims to be real, even though they're different. Okay.
Oh, they're real. You asked me about
exactly
what do you
right.
mean by
reality does matter here. So there's actually two aspects even to that claim. One is the sort of very weak aspect, but again, there are people who would accept it and not. I think that tables and chairs are real. Okay. There are people who deny that. There are people who say, nope, the only thing that is real is the universe as a whole, or quarks and leptons, elementary particles. Those are real, but tables and chairs are just useful illusions, right?
Okay.
Consciousness. I think consciousness is real. Other people say, nope, it's just an illusion. It's not really real. Time, whatever. All these different things, if they're not at the fundamental level, you can say they're illusions. So a poetic naturalist would say, no, come on. I'm going to go through life thinking the tables and chairs are real. And that's also going to lead me to things like consciousness being real. They might be higher level, but at least they are actually out there in the world. They capture some real truth about the world. So that's a set. In other words, there are a set of ways, a set of vocabularies for talking about the world that are all purely scientific, but that are different. Okay. Chemistry or biology or other good ways of talking about the world. You don't only have to stick to fundamental physics.
Right.
Then you get into the realm of things that are more judgmental. There are things that are prescriptive, not just descriptive, okay? Things that are not, according to poetic naturalism, grounded in objectively true facts about the world. Things that are subjective in some sense. And I would argue that you can still have those conversations. You can still talk about real things. You can still talk to another human being about how to be moral in a non-trivial way. But it relies on the fact that typically, not always, but typically, two people talking about morality will start from some common ground. They will have moral impulses built into them, and because of biology or history or education or indoctrination or whatever, they're not blank slates. Okay, they have things that they prefer, they have things that they care about, things they would rather be the case, and happily, different people, 7 billion people here on Earth, we don't all have completely divergent views on what is good and what is bad. We mostly agree, and I think that you can have intelligent, useful, rational discussions starting from that agreement and seeing where you can go, even though it's all fundamentally constructed rather than objective.
I have come across, I know each individual is, you can't blame, like, I talked to this one scientist fella and he was blah, 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 blah. You don't want to put an entire class, but I find in general, there's a bit of a pushback about wanting to talk about what you classify as the subjective for what's real and then the objective of what's real. And some of it might be semantics of language,
A lot might be.
Yeah, right. So yeah, I mean, it might even, just be like, that might be sometimes that could just be it. Like, well, they're talking about real on that from the objective side, and like I'm talking about it from the subjective side, like the fruit situation. But it does feel like when people talk about things that cannot be proven necessarily by science, and I don't want to just mean religion, but you could moral truths or ethics or in the philosophy as well as in the theology sort of space. And I do want to be clear, like I am coming from a space of someone who has faith. So anyways, I don't want to like act like I'm, well, who's perfectly objective, speaking of, but I do want to disclose that. But sure. I have come across people who are just like, don't even, like, no, not falsifiable. Like no, it doesn't count. Throw it out, and I don't quite understand it.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, it would be great if there were some absolutely objective, scientifically provable basis for morality. That would make our lives easy. Then we would have a lot less ambiguity, right?
I think a lot of ethicists are like, yeah.
Yeah. Well, look, you can go on IMDb and get a ranking of all the movies ever made from best to worst. And it's not very objective. No. But what if it were? Like, what if there were just a list of criteria that told you what the best movies were? Then it would be very much easier to decide which movie to watch that night, right? But in reality, there's no such thing as the goodness of a movie. There's how the movie speaks to you, how you interact with that movie. It is fundamentally a subjective thing. And that doesn't mean we can't talk about how good movies are, right? That doesn't mean that your information, having seen a movie, is not useful to me. I might not be exactly the same person as you, but I have some similarities. And if you like a movie or not, that might be helpful for me to decide whether or not I would want to see it. And so I think that people are too quick to think, and maybe this is exactly what you're saying, too quick to think that unless something is objective, you can't talk about it at all. I think that's just a mistake. And I think that
I
this is
think
part
it's
of,
true. I think it's you can't talk about it as true.
you can't talk about it as objective.
But
So look,
okay, okay.
this is, let me, I mean, I think I'm agreeing with you. So I don't want to,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
but I just want to get the language exactly right, because I think that we face problems in this whole domain, that we're using vocabulary words that were invented hundreds of years ago before the concepts we're actually talking about
Yeah, yeah.
were very clear. So whether something's real, whether something is objective, whether something is fundamental, I don't know. I kind of don't care. I care, like, what should we do about it? What
Okay.
are we going to do about it?
Right.
How are we going to behave in the world? How are we going to learn new things? So if someone says, sure, in the morning you decide what to have for breakfast, but secretly that decision is actually the working out of various atoms and neurons in your brain that are all controlled by the laws of physics. So you don't really, I would say, you don't really have free will about making that decision. And whereas I would say, yeah, that's what I mean by free will. You're making that decision. That's what it means. But I don't care. I don't care whether or not the phrase free will is really that important to you. I don't care whether the phrase objectively is really that important to you. I care, like, what are we going to do? How are we going to live?
Okay, so we'll bring up the one that is often the thing that I just can't stand talking about, but I want to be more open to understanding how to talk about it. So, like, talking about God, for example. And again, depends on what you mean by God.
Sure.
Because it's not what it was 200 years ago. Even when Nietzsche was talking about it, I think it is different even now. There's some stuff that people are like fine with, of like, well, as an objective force, well, like the force, like that can be God to some people. But like, okay, so talking about God as real or true, and it makes you be a good person, and it sounds like to me like you're saying, if it works, it's as long as you're a good person. Like, I don't know, like what do you think
Right.
about talking a conversation about, say, talking about God? Where would you go with that? Would you be upset by, like, you need to know the truth, or are you like okay with you do you kind of situation?
I mean, look, I'm certainly okay with a whole bunch of people thinking things I think are false. Otherwise, I would go mad right away, right?
Okay.
But if they want to discuss what I think is true, then I will try to help explain to them. Like, I do not try to force my views of metaphysics and ontology on people who don't want to listen to them, but I'm happy to share with people who are interested. But I do think there's a related thing that slipped by there that I don't want to let go too quickly, which is that I don't think that one's views about the fundamental nature of reality are entirely separate from one's views on morality and meaning and purpose.
Okay.
I don't think that my views on the fundamental nature of reality lead perfectly smoothly and objectively and rigorously to any one set of views about morality and meaning. But I believe that there are views about objective reality which are wrong, that lead to wrong views about morality and meaning. So you can say, what if religion just makes you do good things?
Right.
That would be great. I have noticed throughout history that sometimes religion makes people do bad things.
Very bad things.
And I would be more confident in good things happening if people had what I would consider to be a better view of the fundamental nature of reality.
Okay. So that's where maybe the challenge would be for you, talking about where does it lead?
Yeah, it's very much, there's a really good Pascal's Wager is a really good example
Okay.
here. And I had this insight in a completely different context. I was talking to Martin Rees, a famous astrophysicist, on my podcast, and we were not talking about the existence of God. We were talking about the Large Hadron Collider,
Oh,
a
okay.
giant particle accelerator in Geneva. Because remember, that people were worried when the Large Hadron Collider first turned on, whether it would just destroy the world, right?
Oh, I
Whether or
don't.
not oh yeah, there were people who were worried that it would create a black hole that would eat up the Earth or anything like that.
When was this?
This was circa 2008, something like that. 2007, 2008. Yeah.
I definitely could have. I was in university. I could have paid attention. I didn't.
Well, in my circles, that was a big deal. So
okay, absolutely, yes.
And so so scientists, bless their hearts, really have difficulty saying that something is absolutely impossible, right? When you ask them, could this happen? They really have difficulty saying no. It can't happen.
Oh, I see. Bless their hearts. Okay, I'm getting it.
It's really unlikely. And what they mean is 1 part in a billion chance.
Okay.
And what people hear is there's a 20% chance.
Yeah.
So scientists had a big PR problem there. And Martin Rees was involved in this discussion. And I think he had the wonderful answer, which is, look, there is some chance that when you turn on the Large Hadron Collider, it will destroy the world.
Okay.
It's a very, 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 very small chance. And you might think, well, but isn't that really important? Even if it's a really small chance, shouldn't that count? And he said, well, there's also a small chance that it will cure all diseases and create free energy for the rest of the human existence. Mm-hmm. It's a very, 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 very small chance. Right. But for all of these wild, crazy, unlikely things, you can't just pick out the good or the bad. You have to take both of them. And typically they're going to cancel out because they're wild and crazy and unlikely. Right. And you should deal with the more realistic possibilities. Okay. So I think exactly the same way about the existence of God in Pascal's Wager. Pascal says, look, I don't know whether God exists or not. But if he does, maybe he'd be happy if I believed in him and I would go to heaven. So that seems to benefit me. There's no downside. So I will believe in God. This is a very dopey argument, right?
Okay, let's hear.
Maybe there's a God who would actually be fooled by such a transparent strategy as that. Maybe there's a God who'd be really pissed that that was your argument, that you didn't really believe in him. You were just faking it to get into heaven, and he would torture you forever.
He would know.
There's all sorts of possibilities. Maybe Zeus exists, right? Maybe you're picking the wrong God. Maybe Satan is the boss. So I think that rather than saying, well, something might be true and it's harmless to believe it, therefore let's believe it, I almost never believe those arguments. I think we should focus on what we think is most likely to be true.
Okay, and then go from there. So I have heard this, I've heard sort of you know how the hypothetical about we could be a brain in a vat. And that could be like they bring that up with regards to is there God? Often they're like, we also could be a brain in a vat, but we don't really go there. We don't. That's the critique I've heard in my little circle is like, why don't we talk about it? Like is it because it's the unlikely scenario situation and that's why? But that's the one that I find that scientists often go to for. Well, I believe that over God. Like I've heard that. Or is that
I think that very few people actually are pro BraininAVAT.
Okay.
But it's a good thought experiment for making sure that your own personal attitudes towards the nature of reality are grounded in sensible arguments, right?
Okay.
Because we could be a brain in a vat, and there's literally no way of knowing if the vat were sufficiently sophisticated, or we could be living in a simulation, or we could have just fluctuated randomly into existence. There's a whole bunch of these so-called skeptical scenarios, which are impossible to disprove. Or, the universe that we observe is basically correct, but it was created 6,000 years ago, and God put all the dinosaur fossils in the ground to fool us, right?
To test our faith, yep. 100%. Yep.
So there's all these things that are the correct response to these is not, I have evidence that they're wrong.
Right.
Because by construction, you can't.
Right.
The correct response to these is, I am not going to put a high probability on things like that. unless they actually explain something about the world that I can't explain otherwise, right? The same thing we do with all other theories of physics or science. We choose the most parsimonious, simplest, most straightforward explanation that works. Once it doesn't work anymore, we try to update it, but we don't just say, well, it could be this, like one famous example is it could be that the laws of gravity do not apply to the moon. They apply to literally everything else other than the moon. But inside the moon, there are little angels that push it around in exactly the same way that it would move if the laws of gravity did apply to it. Now, that's the dumbest theory in the world. Like, it predicts exactly the same things that the law of gravity does. It's just much more complicated. But if you say, well, disprove it, prove that it's not right.
Right.
You can't. But who cares? It's silly. And I feel the same way about the BraininAVAT, the simulation, or whatever.
Okay. Now, the idea of I've heard that the laws of gravity don't pertain to the areas around a black hole.
Well, they do.
That it's altered from our understanding of what it typically we imagine it should follow. Is that not right?
Depends on who is typically doing the imagining. So we think that we understand what goes on near black holes pretty well.
Okay.
Not inside. Inside is a little bit more contentious, but nearby, the outside of the black hole, we think we understand pretty well. But to be honest, we're not sure. We don't have a lot of data on what goes on there. And we do keep, learning new things. So in the 1970s, most famously, Stephen Hawking realized that if you put quantum mechanics into the game, then black holes are not completely black. They give off radiation and they will eventually evaporate and disappear. So this might even be what you're referring to, but black holes in classical physics, as Einstein would have imagined them, are different than black holes in the world with quantum mechanics. And we're not sure how different they are. We're still trying to figure that out. Okay,
so the reason why I bring that up is because I've heard the idea that even what we think is objective in some far off reaches of the universe is potentially more on the subjective side. Does that track for what we just discussed in that scenario?
There is something very, very close to that. And I think that, this is an important point. So when I said that tables and chairs exist, right? That could be true from a perspective and not true from another perspective. And black holes are a good example of this. So I tried to be careful in what I just said, that we don't know what's going on inside a black hole. But here's what we think is true. If you have a big black hole, like the black hole at the center of our galaxy, and you hop in a spaceship and you fall into it, nothing happens to you when you enter the black hole right away. Like, eventually you get scrunched and you will die. But at the edge, at what we call the event horizon of the black hole, there's no signpost there that says you have crossed the event horizon. You don't hit a wall, you don't get burned up, you just fly right through, and it's no big deal. But there's an argument, probably too long to really reproduce right here, but there's an argument that says the following thing. To the person outside watching you fall in, okay, if someone doesn't follow you in and they're just observing you, Einstein says that they never see you cross the surface of the black hole. They see you slow down because time is dilated by the force of gravity. So they see you move more and more slowly as you approach the black hole. And what you would eventually see, what is seen from the outside, is as if you are smeared across the entire surface of the black hole. The information that went into making you is now contained, trapped, captured, encoded in the two-dimensional surface of the black hole. And that is a completely different story than what you told yourself when you were falling in, right?
Yes.
So this is called black hole complementarity. And the idea is that neither one of those stories is the once and for all story. They're both true from the point of view of the observer that we're talking about.
Okay, this is the subjectivity that I was sort of thinking of here. Okay.
That's right. So, but to be super clear, if this story is true, which we don't know because no one has fallen into a black hole, okay, this is all very speculative, but if it is true, there is still something objectively true about reality. But in the spirit of poetic naturalism, there are different ways of talking about it. So in this case, there's one way of talking about it that is perceived to the infalling observer, and another way that is seen to the person who stays outside.
So they're both true.
Yes.
Because, okay. I have tried to. Sounds like my head's like, which way do I want to go with this? So, because I'm trying to understand how to talk about it, how to understand, how to have some things be true in one sense, but then maybe not. The true for me, but not true for you.
Yeah, but so yeah, I think, and this goes back to where we started out right at the beginning, where when people use the word real or people use the word meaning, they can use it in different senses. Likewise, the word true, right? Is it true that bananas are the best fruit? Maybe for me that is true, but nobody thinks that's objectively true. No one is even pretending. I hope that many people don't really think that. Some people might think that, Shakespeare was objectively the best playwright in the English language. Others are going to say, oh, come on, that is clearly a subjective judgment. So I think it turns out, and you're putting your finger on this correctly, that there's a version of that is even true in the hardest of hard sciences, okay? There are different ways of talking about the same underlying reality. The underlying reality is there. There is some truth, right? There is something objective, but it might not be the statement, here's a table, or there's an electron, or I fell into a black hole. Statements like that might only be true from some perspective and not from another one.
Well, because there's only a perspective, because isn't that how we speak and how we convey meaning and how we're conversing right now?
Well, we do, but it has been traditional in science to imagine that there is a God's eye perspective, even if you don't believe in God. Even if you don't believe in God, you still think that he has a perspective.
Right.
In other words, you still imagine, and this goes back to Laplace. Okay, Laplace in 1800 says, imagine that a vast intelligence knows the position and velocity of everything in the universe.
Well,
He never meant to say that you should try. You can't. You're never going to succeed in knowing those things. But he said he implicitly assumed that he was allowed to imagine knowing all of that at once, and that is something that physicists continue to do. Not always unproblematically. Sometimes people are going to say there isn't a God's eye view or whatever, but that's something we talk about, something we debate.
So okay. I love that's the God's eye view thing. I've never heard that before, so that's.
Oh yeah.
Oh, funny, because we are only using. The reason he used the word God is probably because he. Oh, you guys know what I mean. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Laplace was an atheist.
Well, of course, I imagined.
He's the one who famously. It's a probably apocryphal story, but he was in France in the year 1800, of course. So he presented his great textbook on celestial mechanics to Emperor Napoleon. And Napoleon didn't read his book, but Napoleon got fed a line by one of his advisors. He said, ask him about whether or not God is anywhere in his book. And Laplace said, I had no need for that hypothesis. Okay. So that was slightly artful. I'm not sure whether or not it was very diplomatic or not, but Napoleon got a laugh out of it. Okay. But it's just like not only Laplace, but Einstein talked about God all the time, right? And they don't mean a guy up there in a beard. They don't even mean some personal deity that cares about human beings. It's a metaphorical way of talking about the way the universe works.
Right. But it is interesting because it gives the magnitude that we as humans, as English speakers with the name God as the stand-in for the big thing.
Exactly right. And I kind of am sad that I can't use that language more often because it's very helpful, but people are always like, well, wait, do you believe in God now? And I have to explain what I mean. Like, no, I'm talking like a scientist using the metaphor, but
right. A metaphor.
Well, not even to try.
Maybe, All right. Well, like you could. It would be an open a whole nother line of thinking. But
Yep.
well, because I know that this is something that a lot, like, I mean, everyone who's studied like or understands evolution understands that we have evolved with a certain set of abilities for our survival from a perspective, and the truth was not paramount. Right?
Well, yes and no. I think this is a very good
Okay.
point. The truth is not irrelevant.
Correct. 100%.
But
Yeah.
the truth is not paramount either. I think you're completely correct.
Mm.
We evolved, and we evolved shortcuts, right? We evolved heuristics for dealing with the world, largely because when the tiger is chasing you, you don't have time to like literally stop and smell the roses, right? Or even think to yourself, maybe this is a nice tiger. Like you have to act in certain ways that will maximize your chances of survival. And so we do, we have a finite calculational capacity in our brains, and we try to use them in efficient ways. So it's not unrelated to the truth, but it's not, the human brain was absolutely not optimized for discovering the truth about reality.
Right. And well, it depends on who you ask, because some people I speak to are like, there's no such thing as, but we can never really get at objective truth because there's always a perspective. But then others are like, no, but we try to.
Well, I mean, strictly speaking, the two statements you just made are not incompatible,
Right?
I mean, maybe we try knowing that we will never completely succeed. As a scientist, I know that we have not succeeded in getting objectively true, completely correct things about the universe. As a Bayesian, I know that we shouldn't ever assign 100% probability to any of our favorite propositions, because then we can never change our minds, right? So I find that objective reality is a very important concept. The existence of the universe as an objective thing. Objective truth as something that we human beings have learned about reality is way more messy. Like that's and it's not really useful. I mean, it's much more useful to admit that we have degrees of belief where, we can be so certain in some things that we're like, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm 99.999% sure. So I'm not going to worry about it, right? Okay. I'm not going to worry about being a brain in a vat.
Right.
I'm just going to move on with my life. That's fine. But I'm not worried about whether it's rigorously, metaphysically, 100% objectively true. That's not something that science ever achieves.
So would you want to know if you were a brain in a vat? Or would you be fine not knowing?
No, I want to know everything. I want to know it all.
See, you are. Okay, so that is, I've asked the question. I think I asked the question on my Twitter, like, would you want to know if you were in the darkest timeline? And so many people said yes. And I was like, why? Yes. Like, it doesn't change. Like, I mean, I know as if you could know. But if you could know but do nothing about it, if you just wanted to have the information, I think it's a scientific I have a lot of scientists on my Twitter. So I think that people just the sola truth, like a truth above all.
Yeah. Want to know, you're curious.
Why would you want to why would you want to know, even if it wouldn't change? Because you mentioned like you can't change anything about it. Why would you want to know just because?
Well, I can, I'm motivated by curiosity to understand how the world works at a fundamental level. That's the simple reason. Right. Even if it doesn't change how I choose my favorite fruit or whatever, it might change how I think about cosmology and the Big Bang if I'm just a brain in a vat.
Right. You're in that little bit of space where it really does
it might matter, yeah.
Yeah. You're like, I'd like to figure out is it just a room? Is the universe just one room in the Matrix style? I know that, of course, most scientists are curious, like you were mentioning before about wanting to know if you were a brain in a vat. But I find that you are really curious about other spaces, like in your podcast, where you search other specialties. And I'm wondering, have you always just been like, I want to know other things outside of my specialty? How long have you, I mean, I imagine it's a lifelong thing, but I'm curious as to your story there.
Yeah, it's a lifelong thing. I've always been curious about many things, especially, roughly speaking, things that I would consider more fundamental, right? Like the biggest questions. Those are the ones that do interest me. And honestly, I'm not that interested in like the technological applications of things.
Okay.
I'm happy for them. I like them. Good for that. But, once I understand it, I move on.
Okay.
And even within physics or even within science or intellectual life, I'm very short attention span. So I want to be thinking about several things at once. This is why the podcast is perfect for me. This is why having interest in science and philosophy is also perfect for me. This is why I recently became external professor at the Santa Fe Institute, which is the world's leading institute studying complex systems.
Okay.
And a complex system could be the universe, or it could be a human cell, or it could be the economy, right? Or it could be
yeah. Okay.
So they get to study all these really cool, very, very different things. And it's just, like a kid in a candy store for someone like me, because most academic departments are not interested in that. They do not want you wandering off the reservation. So I like wandering off the reservation, always have. Yeah.
Okay. Why don't they want you wandering?
Well, I think so. If I were to steelman their point of view, if I were to try to make it a persuasive case, I would say your job as a professor at a major research institution is to do research. And research is helped by focusing on one thing and not letting your mind wander onto other things. The best research in something, especially like theoretical, is done when you're thinking about it all the time, they would say. I would not agree with this, but I think this is the argument that if you think too heavily about too many different things, you're just distracted from the one thing that is important.
But what about, like, Newton with the apple on his head? He was doing something else.
It's clearly there is a balance in the real world, right? I mean, in the real world, even the most ornery non-interdisciplinarian would say you shouldn't be so focused that you're only thinking about exactly one thing all the time. You should go to the seminars in your group, in your department, and hear what other people are working on. It might inspire you. But, those boundaries are pretty narrow. So, in my department at Caltech, I'm in the physics department, but in particular, I'm in the theoretical physics group. And that theoretical physics group is what we call high energy physics, which is particle physics, cosmology, things like that. And even there, it's subdivided into sort of ordinary particle physics and string theory and quantum gravity. And the two groups don't overlap very much. So when I say, you're supposed to go to all the seminars, someone might go to only the string theory seminars. And that's their breadth of interdisciplinary engagement. And, everyone thinks you should do that. But if you said, well, I want to start going to biophysics seminars, or I want to start to go to seminars on the history of the French Revolution or the origin of Indo-European languages.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Like, crazy, right? Like,
really?
You are being bad.
Okay, well, I am glad that you're pushing back against the system in your way, in your podcast way, and that we get to see different perspectives of you, because it's cool to hear you in your curious space and then in your specialty space.
Yeah, the podcast is great for me because I hesitated starting one for a long time because, I have interests in, neuroscience or morality or whatever, but I couldn't possibly just get up and talk about them in any, principled expert way. I'm not an expert in these areas.
Yeah.
So the idea that I can call up experts and have them on the show, call up a Nobel Prize winning virologist and talk about viruses. That's perfect for me. And I know enough to ask good questions, but mostly it's about I want people on the show who my listeners can learn from. Not necessarily people I agree with, but I don't want someone on the show to show they're wrong. Like I would never invite someone on my show to explain why they're incorrect. I will only have people on my show who I think that everyone can learn something from.
Okay, and that's why we like you. That's why we like Sean Carroll. Okay, that's a good place to end, I'm gonna say.
Oh, thank you very much. Yes.
Open minds, friends. Okay. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm really excited to edit because then I'll get to watch it all back and be like, what did we talk about?
Andrew, this is great. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.